Okay, enough about that, and enough about the organization. And
Tell them about that radio just acquired the
I'm going to tell about it. Okay, what she's talking about, since she's already started it, we have some real special radios in our museum that we're really very proud of. One of them is on our on our brochure, and it's that radio right there. And what that radio is, that is a Superflex. And that radio was made in Norwood. Did anybody know there was a Radio Products Corporation in Norwood? There was. And they made that radio, and quite a few of them sold. We are very fortunate to have 2 of them. And we think that there's not but maybe 1 or 2 more in existence anywhere. But we do have one in our museum. And that's one of the things that did go in the display in Montgomery. The one that my wife Celeste is talking about is one we just recently acquired, which is called a Code Talker radio. And what it is, the Navajos in World War II actually were able to communicate with this radio, and nobody could ever break the code. They never figured out what these guys were talking about. But believe you me, they were able to pass along some very detailed information in the Marine Corps that was quite necessary. So that's the latest edition that we've got in our museum. Okay, what I want to do is talk about what I'm here for. And this is radio and with a Homewood connection. Okay, this has been, when we formed the organization in 1989, within a year or so, the founder of our organization, Don Kresge, and I started looking for the person that started WSGN. And most of you, I'm sure, anybody certainly with any age that's here, knows about WSGN. It was the station to listen to back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They had all of the Tommy Charles and all of the great people that everybody was so interested in. Anyway, what we knew, or what we were able to find out, is that the station started out in 1926, and it started out as WKBC, and it was put on by a man named Pop Ansley. Well, we pretty well figured that Pop was a nickname. We went through every telephone book we could find. And back in the 80s, telephone books were about that thick, and they were all white pages, you know. And we called every Ansley that was in the telephone book. We found out absolutely nothing. And so we just had to kind of brush it aside. But it was on our website that Pop Ansley had started WSGN. Well, about 3 years ago, well, it hadn't been that long, a couple of years ago, when Tom was our president, he got an email from a lady, and she was doing some history research and had come across our website, and she saw a request from Pop Ansley. She said, "That's my grandfather." And it was. It turned out that her grandfather was Hewitt LeGrand Ansley. And this man here was born in Sulphur Springs, Alabama. That is a challenge right there to find out where Sulphur Springs was. As it turned out, it was a hotel up in northeast Alabama, and he was born in a hotel called the Sulphur Springs Hotel. And why did that happen? It's because his dad, who was born in 1841, was in charge of the Southern Railway all the way from Valley Head down to Attala. Anything that took place, tracks that had to be worked on, switches that had to be changed out, anything along that railroad was his responsibility. And So that's the reason that our friend Ansley was born along the railroad up in the northeast part of Alabama. Now, he was born in 1879. Okay, you can figure out that the time 1900 came, he would have been 21 years old. Unfortunately, his father passed away when he was 4 years old, but he had an older brother who was 12 years older than him that just kind of took him under his wing and was determined to help him be somebody special. So, Big Brother in 1898 was reading in the newspapers about the gold rush and the Yukon, and he got the right idea. He was going to go from Birmingham to the Yukon, and he was going to pan for gold and make all kinds of money, and he was going to be a rich man. I meant to mention this right here. This is Pop Ansley's granddaughter when she was about 4 years old. Her name is Sally Gates, and she does live in Columbus, Georgia. And this was his house on Ponciana in the Hollywood section of Homewood. And I'll get back to that in just a minute. Okay, Big Brother. He went to the Yukon in 1898 and tried panning for gold, and it didn't work. By the way, he had trouble getting to where he was going because even though he had an in with the railroads, he could get as far as Whitehorse, just in the lower part of the Yukon. He couldn't get any further north. And he wanted to get up to Dawson, where everybody was finding gold. It was 350 miles. And somehow we don't know till today how he got there, but he did. But anyway, he didn't make any money. He tried, but it was more than what he could do. So he got this bright idea. Well, I'll build a hotel. And I'll let the miners pay me with their gold money that they're making, and we'll come out great. And if you look right there, that says W. Ansley Proprietor, and that was his hotel that he built in the period that he was there just before 1900. In 1900, his little brother, who he was, invited him to come to the Yukon and help him out with his hotel and everything like that. And little brother did. He even got a permission slip to pan for gold, and he did pan for gold, and he actually was able to find some, which Big Brother hadn't found, but it was really nice that he had a place to stay. This is a nugget, and I don't know if you can tell from the necklace how big it is, but it's a pretty good sized nugget. I have seen it, and it is a very pretty nugget. But that is one of the gold nuggets that he found. We're talking about Hewlett, the younger one, that he found, and he had it made into a watch chain. The people back then used a lot of pocket watches. So he had it. Well, the granddaughter didn't wear a pocket watch, so she had it made into a necklace, and it is her possession today. But I thought that was kind of pretty. It really didn't work out for Hewlett in the Yukon either. Believe it or not, that last 360 miles from Whitehorse to Dawson, he had to ride a bicycle to get there. That's the only way he could do it. I don't know how long it took him, but that's the way he got there. So he was up there for 2 or 3 years, and it wasn't his thing. The weather wasn't like Birmingham weather, and it was just a tough place to be. So he came back to Birmingham, and he went to work. He went to work for the crane company, and you can see that it says crane company here. Let me tell you a little about this. He to work for the Crane Company in about 1905, I think it was, and he did work for the Crane Company for right at 40 years. The Crane Company is not a company that has these big cranes or anything like that. It's a plumbing company. It was started in 1855 in Chicago, and it's still in existence today. But it's a good-sized company. And in 1914, they had the Master Plumbers Convention in the city of Birmingham. And the Crane Company was invited to be there because they were a significant supplier of plumbing for the plumbing industry. In fact, this is a valve, and it is a valve that would have been used at a hydroelectric plant, and it was made by the Crane Company. And that's what our friend Hewlett was working for and selling. And this one here was made for Alabama Power Company. I'm sure it's in one of the hydro dams out here that are even probably still working today. But that was in 1917 when the power company got that valve. Okay, I haven't even mentioned radio about our buddy Hewlett, but he got into radio about 1915 and got interested in radio. And he built this wireless telegraphy transmitter in his basement and was operating using Morse code and talking to all kinds of interesting people. In fact, as most of you know, the Titanic disaster occurred in 1912. And the federal government, after that, because there was a lot of interference problems with the emergency communications during the Titanic recovery efforts. And so the government in 1913 passed a law that if your transmitter could be heard over a state line, it became a federal thing, and you had to have a license. And our friend Hewlett got a license, and it was 5EH was his license. He was very proud of it. He had to take a test to get it and everything. But that was his introduction to radio. Unfortunately, along comes the World War I, and when it did, the government didn't just shut down these guys that were transmitting. It was illegal to listen to a radio in World War I because of all the military operations. And by the way, we do have a beautiful Marconi radio from 1917 in our museum that was very popular during that time. Okay. Now we got to find out about what happened with Pop Ansley. And by the way, one other thing that was really interesting about Ansley, in 1914, he and a Dr. Ballard started Camp Winnetoska, which is still going today. So he did a lot of different things. Okay. After the war was over, there was a huge rush of interest in radio and radio transmitting and everything. And this man talking on the microphone here, his name is Tom Brown. He also had a license, 5EQ. And he also was the uncle of Charlotte Dominic. And Charlotte Dominic was a weather girl on TV in Birmingham for a while, and then she became Jefferson County's treasurer for the county of Jefferson County. But anyway, her uncle built that radio, and it worked. He could talk on it, and what a lot of these guys would do back then, they would take a phonograph record and play it through a horn like that, that's right there, and they would see how far they could get away from that transmitter and still hear it. That was their way to find out how well it worked. So this transmitter, as we have just said, worked, and it worked very well. Our friend Hewlett found out that he had that transmitter, and in 1924, he bought it. He bought it from Tom Brown, and his idea at that time was to start a broadcast station in Birmingham. There was only one other broadcast station at that time, and it was put on by the power company, and I'm going to tell you a little about it. It was WSY, and we'll talk about it in just a minute. In 1926, this is February of 1926, our friend Ansley, who was listed right here at the top and was listed as president, started a club called the Birmingham Radio Club. And Ansley's here. This guy here, J.C. Bell, started WBRC. This guy here, Billy Hood, who lived, by the way, in the Arlington Mansion, because his mother was married to a Munger, and so he was raised at Arlington. But anyway, Billy Hood was also one of the experimenters. He had a license 5GI, and he was quite active in. But all of them at that time were not putting together any kind of a hobby type thing. They were serious. This was to start radio broadcasting in the city of Birmingham, in the state of Alabama. Okay, our buddy Hewlett finally succeeded in getting a license to broadcast. He was issued from the FCC the call letters WKBC, and he operated from his house in Fountain Heights. This is on 12th Avenue North in Fountain Heights, the north side of Birmingham. And he had kind of a hobby idea to some extent, because he had a full-time job. He worked for the crane company. He would get home about 7 o'clock at night, 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. He'd grab him a bite of supper and go turn on his broadcasting station, and he'd keep it on until maybe 10 or 10:30 at night. So WKBC could be listened to, except maybe on the weekends, from 7 o'clock at night till about 10 or 10:30 at night. And that was about it. He did this for about 3 years, and then he decided it really wasn't his thing. So what he did, he found somebody that was interested in buying it, and it was R.B. Broyles Furniture Company. And R.B. Broyles must have paid him a healthy price, because this was 1928, and he immediately bought a house in Hollywood. So, and Hollywood was brand new at that time when Mr. Nelson was developing Hollywood, and did in 28 as a separate city. Unfortunately, because of the stock market crash and things like that, they did merge. I shouldn't have said unfortunately. They did merge with Homewood, and Hollywood became part of Homewood, as I'm sure most of you know. Anyway, this is the end of WKBC as far as our guy Ansley is concerned. Let me just tell you how he ended up getting the name Hop. Think about it. Okay, here's all these guys that he's working with and on that Birmingham Radio Club. Most of them were in their early 20s. Well, I told you Pop was born in 1879. And so that's where the nickname came from. They all called him Pop because he was that much older than me. This is an article that came out in the Birmingham News in 1951, and what it talks about is Pop Ansley and how he started it with a 10-watt transmitter, and how it was now a 5,000-watt station. The call letter WSGN. Now, where did that come from? Well, R.B. Broyles had started it in their furniture company, and they decided after about 5 years that it really wasn't exactly what they needed, and they had some interference from other stations in downtown, so they decided to sell it, and they sold it to the Birmingham News. Birmingham News bought it and changed the call letters to WSGN, South's greatest newspaper, and that's where that came from. This does tell a lot of the story about him getting started. He did have to get some help from a state senator to get his license in the first place, so he had some close connections and all of that. Okay, as I said, he moved to Hollywood, and this is our buddy Ansley right here as a volunteer in a mayoral election in Homewood, and I think it was 34 or 35. He was very active, and he lived in Homewood on Ponciana in the Hollywood section from about 1928 till about 1947. So, okay, let me just go on and say the election clerk here is Mr. Ansley. This is an interview that was done in 1954. In the meantime, what our buddy Ansley had done was he got old and he retired. He worked for a crane company for 40 years. So in about 1946, he retired, and he was at that point still very good friends with a man named John Carlisle Bell. And Lyle Bell started WBRC about 6 months before WKBC was started. But he was much, much younger than what Pop Ansley was. But he taught Pop Ansley and Pop Ansley's wife and his wife into going to St. Augustine, Florida. And when they did, they bought the rights to a radio station there, WFOY, Fountain of Youth, in St. Augustine, Florida. And this is an article in the WFOY newsletter talking about Pop Ansley's early days in radio and his history of radio and what it all meant, to Birmingham and to a lot of the radio history that we're talking about. And that, he passed away, this is 1954, he passed away in St. Augustine in 1959, and he would have been 80 years old at that point. And what's interesting is when we were looking for him in 1989, that was 30 years after he passed away. It's no wonder we couldn't find him, to tell you the truth, but his granddaughter has been very helpful in helping us to get the history that we've got of this man, and he was really an interesting guy, as I think all of you can see. Okay, this was the obituary that came out in the Birmingham News. He is buried at Elmwood Cemetery, and it's interesting that they recognized in the obituary the importance or the fact that he was a gold rusher. Okay, we can put Pop Ansley to bed. That's all I've got to say about him. I just wanted you to know he was an interesting character, and he was very active at Homewood, lived in Homewood. This is our number 2 example of Homewood radio history. Now, did anybody know that there was a radio station at the Hollywood Country Club, of all places? That is a beautiful place, and it certainly, I wish it was still there. It certainly was a great place to go swimming. I had the I don't know what your stupidity, I guess it was, of being able to say that I swam from one end of that pool to the other underwater without coming up. Anyway, what's the connection with radio and the Hollywood Country Club? This man right here, Gene Newman, was a speech teacher at Shade Valley High School. And in 1957, I was a senior at Shade Valley High School. And Gene Newman had decided to put a radio station on in the Homewood Country Club in 1957. And he needed some help in operating his radio station. And I volunteered to be one of the helpers with the radio station. The station was located by the dance floor in the Homewood Country Club, and across the street, across Lakeshore Drive, was the transmitter and the antenna for the radio station. The station's call letters were WEZB, and it was one of the first fully automated stations that was in existence in Birmingham. And what he had a Seaberg 100 record player that played 45s, and it would hold 100 of them, and it was automatic. And then he had an Ampex reel-to-reel recording setup that all of his commercials were on. Now, what was interesting about this, as soon as the record finished, the reject or the reset would come on, and he used that contact to start the tape recorder. And the tape recorder would play a commercial, and at the end of the commercial, he had a 30-cycle tone that would start the record player back. So normally, it would just sit there and play records for hours at a time with a commercial in between. And sometimes the commercial would be skipped, and you could do that with that 30 hertz tone that he had. But it really was a unique idea, and he had a studio there by the dance floor if he had a live activity, but since he was gone most of the time, he didn't do like Pop Ansley and just shut his station off. The station stayed on the air, and it was WEZB, and which he was called it an easy listening station. Unfortunately, he got crossways with the Communication Workers Union. I guess you could say because of us young guys that were helping him out. And what we were doing was legal. All we had to do was record the transmitter information and keep it up to date and everything, and keep the station on the air. That's all we had to do. And the station was sun up to sundown, and there were several of us that did this, and we kept it going. It was very successful. So what actually happened, and they still never convicted anybody of it, but for some reason the guy wires on that tower got cut, and obviously the tower fell down. And you might realize where that tower was directly across from the Homewood Country Club is where Brookwood Mall is today. At that time, it was just a marsh where the old lake bed had been at one time, or was. And it was an excellent location for a transmitter to work, and WEZB had excellent coverage. So what happened to WEZB? Well, Gene Newman decided he moved the transmitter out near Birmingham Southern, and he moved us guys and the studio to the 13th floor of the Tutwiler Hotel. And most of you know hotels don't have 13 floors. We are on the 13th floor. We could take the elevator up to the 12th floor. I could ride my motorcycle down and park it down under the building and go up the 12th. We did keep the station going. And one thing I will mention, in 1959, I think it was, it may have been 58, Elvis Presley had to go in the Army. I don't know if any of you Elvis Presley fans remember, but he actually had to go in the Army. And my boss, Gene Newman, decided, okay. He came down and filled this Seaberg 100 record player with Elvis Presley and nothing else. And to this day, after listening to Elvis Presley from sun up to sundown, I'm not a big fan of Elvis. Let me just tell you about this. The announcer that created the tapes on WETV's name was Ward McIntyre. Ward McIntyre lived on Morris Boulevard, if any of you are familiar with Edgewood, and he eventually became Bozo the Clown on the TV. But anyway, I got to know Ward very well during the time I was working at WETV. He was a really, really great guy to know, and I was real proud of being able to say what I knew him. Okay, I'm running close on time, so I'm going to tell you a little about this guy here. This is the third example of Homewood radio connection. Joe Rumore, in 1964, also was kind of an entrepreneur, a far-looking guy, or whatever you want to call it. He decided that he did not want to drive all the way to Bessemer to be on the radio when he was working for WVOK on the Bessemer Superhighway. He lived on Romson Road. Anybody know where that is? Right behind the Hollywood Country Club, just about. And he built in his basement a full operating studio that he could operate, and leased a telephone line from AT&T to Bessemer that he transmitted or put all of the, of course it was all voice back then, wasn't any video, but that's the way he got his signal to the transmitter out at WVOK. He was really a very interesting guy. He operated from 64 to 82 from his basement and was able to have absolutely huge audience, listeners. And he also had a large number of advertisers, and I'm sure he made good money out of it. And this is the only thing that we have been able to be proud of, that we've been able to preserve in the way of equipment that is actually was actually used, that we can tell the history of. And we do have it in our, not our museum, but our exhibit area. But the family, and it sat in his basement for almost 30 years. And it was not in very good shape. Jim Coffin over here knows what it took to get that equipment back up and running, but it took a lot of work to get it cleaned up and working. But we do have Joe Rumore's basement studio in our exhibit area, and if you ever heard Joe Rumore and want to come see what he was talking to, we invite you to come see. This is the equipment that we have. This is him operating it in his basement as he did. And that completes what I have to say about radio with the Homewood connection. And what I'd like to do is offer you a few minutes of, Rachel's permission, a few minutes of questions, if anybody has any questions that I might be able to answer. Yes, ma'am?
I have a weird question. How do you come up with the call letters? Like, who comes up with the call letters?
Okay.
How are those created?
The Federal Communications Commission does have call letters that they can issue. And if you just happen to have some connection to a particular call area that's not being used, like when WVRC was issued, Carlisle Bell got it because he was and that's where it came from. And then WFOY was able, there was another station there in St. Augustine called WAOC, which was America's oldest city. And so that's where those come from. But then a lot of them, like WKBC, really didn't mean anything when he got it. It was just what he was issued. Let me just mention something real quick here, and that is WSY was a broadcast station that was put on. It was the first broadcast station in the state of Alabama, the first. It was put on in April of 1922. It only lasted for about 2 years. It was shut down in December of 24. The power company, Thomas Martin, who was president at the time, put it on the air, and he, or the power company, used, talk about call letters, "We serve you," WSY, and that's where that came from. But he put it on the air mostly for the employees, believe it or not, and what he was trying to do, they had people working out in all areas of Alabama, the hydro dams and the electric REA type thing that was going on, and he wanted to keep his employees entertained and informed, and that's what he put the radio station on for, was to do that. And that station ended up getting donated to Alabama Polytechnic Institute, which some of you may know as Auburn. And the call letters came WAPI. It was moved back to Birmingham in 1928, and it's still in existence today. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How expensive was it to purchase your personal radio back in different phases of?
I had a real good friend. His name was Pete Sides, and he gave his wife to be when she was a senior at Inslee High, and this was in 1930, a radio when she was the only girl in her senior class with her own radio, and it took him a month's salary to do it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's great.
Yes, sir.
And me?
Yes.
Today, thank you again for what you do to educate all of us. There are a couple of things I wondered if you remembered, since you worked with Newman back in that transitional year, 1956, 7, 8. A lot of things were changing in radio, and I interviewed him a number of years ago for the Black Radio Museum, and he talked about the fact that Bob Umbach, who had started the Atomic Boogie Hour in 1946 at JLD, was actually working with him very, very briefly. Does that ring a bell?
That does ring a bell. One thing also I might mention was WEZB became WENN. I don't know if you knew that, but it did.
Yeah.
And so it's, and I think it's still basically
Frequency
here.
swap.
Yeah, this is the call swap.
The other thing I wanted to ask, if you spoke to folks in Homewood, WJLN, which was simulcast in WJLD beginning in 1948, put up a tower in Red Mountain and had a Homewood address. Just to
One more
add to
connection.
the staff.
Any other question? Yes, ma'am.
So you were talking about Pop Ainsley being very proud of his certificate of qualifying and getting his, and my question is, as years went on, did those particular certificates, or what you call them, get longer numbers and letters, so he had like an early one, or is he just really proud of getting?
He had a very early one.
That's what I think.
5, EH was,
Right.
would be today, it would have to have a prefix, like a KA or a WA or a W or something like that ahead of the number, and then it would have at least 2 and probably 3 letters after that, so you're right, yes. And that was certainly required because there are, I forgot how many thousands of guys are out, Johnny, are out there today, 300,000? It's a big number. Yeah.
Bunch.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed doing it. I'm glad we could do it.